One rainy evening, a young watchman stood on top of a stone wall staring into the darkness beyond the city. The wind carried strange sounds across the fields. At first they were so faint he almost ignored them. Then they came again. Slow, steady, metal scraping against earth. He looked toward the soldiers beside him, but they heard nothing. Only one group inside the city was still awake. Deep below the rooftops, where warm ovens glowed through the night, bakers were kneading dough for the next morning's bread. Within a few hours, those bakers would become part of one of history's greatest legends. A legend so famous that millions would eventually believe it explained the birth of one of the world's most beloved pastries. But legends have a strange habit of hiding the truth. And in this story, the truth is far more surprising than the myth. Every morning, across almost every continent, people tear apart warm golden layers without thinking twice. Coffee shops in Paris, cafes in Tokyo, bakeries in New York, hotels in Dubai, and small roadside cafes across Europe all serve the same familiar shape. Crispy outside, soft inside, rich with butter. It feels timeless, almost as if it has existed forever. Yet the croissant is one of history's greatest culinary mysteries. No one can point to the exact baker who created it. No one can identify the precise day it appeared. Even the famous story behind it may not be true. So how did a simple crescent-shaped pastry become one of the most recognizable foods on Earth? The answer begins not in a bakery, but on a battlefield where an empire stood on the edge of victory. The year was 1683. Europe held its breath as one of the largest armies on the continent surrounded the Austrian capital of Vienna. The Ottoman Empire had already conquered vast territories stretching across 3 continents. Now Vienna stood between the empire and the rest of Central Europe. More than 100,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded the city. Their colorful tents stretched across the countryside like an endless sea. Cannons thundered day after day. Thick smoke drifted over damaged walls. Inside the city, fear grew heavier with every sunrise. Food supplies shrank. Wells became precious. Families rationed every loaf of bread. Soldiers fought exhaustion as much as they fought the enemy. But what frightened Vienna's defenders most was not the army they could see. It was the one they could not. The Ottoman military had mastered the dangerous art of siege mining. Instead of attacking walls directly, specialized engineers dug tunnels beneath them. Once they reached the foundations, they packed the tunnels with explosives. One successful blast could collapse an entire section of stone, allowing thousands of soldiers to rush inside. It was silent warfare. Invisible warfare. Every night the miners crept closer while the city above remained unaware. Almost everyone slept after sunset. Almost everyone except the bakers. Long before alarm clocks existed, bakers lived by a different rhythm. Their work began while the rest of the city dreamed. Fires burned throughout the night. Flour covered wooden tables. Heavy dough was mixed by hand beneath flickering candlelight. The streets outside remained silent except for the occasional horse or distant guard patrol. According to one of Europe's most enduring legends, those quiet hours saved Vienna. The story claims that the bakers began hearing strange sounds beneath their bakery floors. Gentle tapping, scraping, rhythmic digging. At first they ignored it, believing it came from settling buildings or underground water. But the sounds returned night after night. Finally, they alerted the city authorities. Soldiers investigated and discovered Ottoman miners tunneling beneath the walls. The attack was stopped just in time. Days later, relief forces led by King John III Sobieski of Poland defeated the Ottoman army in one of European history's most important battles. It is an unforgettable story. And that may be exactly why people continued telling it. According to the legend, Vienna's grateful bakers wanted to celebrate their survival. Instead of raising monuments, they baked pastries shaped like crescents, mocking the symbol associated with the Ottoman Empire. Every bite represented victory over an enemy that had nearly conquered the city. Over time, this pastry supposedly became the ancestor of today's croissant. It sounds perfect. Perhaps a little too perfect. When modern historians began examining the evidence, they discovered something unexpected. Contemporary accounts of the siege describe the battles in extraordinary detail. Military reports survive, letters survive, official records survive, yet none clearly mention heroic bakers discovering enemy tunnels. The famous bakery story appears decades later. That does not automatically make it false. Many historical events survive first through oral tradition, but historians cannot confirm it with certainty. Then they uncovered another clue. Centuries before the siege of Vienna, Austrian records already mentioned a pastry called the Kipferl. This changed everything. The Kipferl appeared in medieval documents dating back to at least the 13th century. Unlike the modern croissant, it was denser and sweeter. Some versions contained almonds, others were flavored with spices or honey. Bakers prepared them for festivals, weddings, and religious celebrations. Most importantly, many Kipferl already had the same familiar crescent shape. Suddenly, the famous victory story became much more complicated. If crescent-shaped pastries already existed for hundreds of years, then the bakers of Vienna could not have invented the shape after defeating the Ottomans. So why did the legend become so popular? Because people love stories that connect food with great historical moments. Food becomes more meaningful when it carries a dramatic past. A simple pastry becomes a symbol of courage. A baker becomes a hero. Even today, countless visitors hear the Vienna story without realizing historians still debate its accuracy. But if the croissant did not truly begin during the siege, where did it come from? The answer lay hundreds of miles away inside one of Europe's most luxurious palaces. In 1770, a 14-year-old Austrian princess crossed the border into France. Her name was Marie Antoinette. Her marriage to the future King Louis V was meant to strengthen political ties between Austria and France after years of conflict. She left behind everything familiar. Her language sounded different from those around her. The customs of Versailles were strict and exhausting. Every movement inside the palace followed complicated rules. Even getting dressed became a public ceremony watched by nobles. Far from home, people often long for familiar food. Many historians believe Marie Antoinette continued enjoying Austrian pastries during her years in France, although no surviving document proves she personally introduced the Kipferl. Austrian baking traditions slowly became fashionable among members of the French court. Wealthy families often copied the tastes of royalty. If the queen enjoyed something, aristocrats wanted it too. That small cultural exchange would eventually have enormous consequences. French bakers were already among Europe's greatest craftsmen. Bread was not simply food in France. It was part of daily life, politics, and even social stability. Poor harvests could spark riots. Governments monitored bread prices closely because they understood how important bakeries were to ordinary people. Pastry, however, offered something different. It rewarded creativity. Bakers competed fiercely for wealthy customers. They experimented constantly with butter, eggs, sugar, and new techniques. Every improvement brought more business. Every beautiful creation attracted attention. Yet despite their skill, French bakers still had not created the pastry we recognize today. Something important was still missing, and strangely enough, it would arrive not through royalty, but through competition. Nearly 70 years later, an ambitious Austrian businessman named August Zang arrived in Paris with a dream. Born in Vienna in 1807, Zang first served as an artillery officer before deciding that business offered greater opportunities than military life. He understood something many entrepreneurs still understand today. People become curious when they encounter something unfamiliar. In 1839, he opened the Boulangerie Viennoise on Rue de Richelieu in Paris. It immediately attracted attention. Instead of selling ordinary French bread alone, Zang specialized in Viennese baked goods. Customers crowded around the windows to see products they had never tasted before. Journalists wrote about the bakery. Food critics praised its quality. Curious Parisians lined up every morning. Rival bakers noticed. And that was exactly what Zang wanted. Competition spread faster than advertisements ever could. Soon, French bakers began trying to recreate the Viennese specialties inside their own shops. At first, they believed success would be easy. After all, they already possessed exceptional baking skills. They were wrong. The recipes looked simple on paper. The dough was anything but simple. Every attempt introduced new problems. Butter escaped from the edges during rolling. Dough stuck to work tables. Layers fused together inside hot ovens. Some pastries emerged dense and heavy. Others collapsed before cooling. Entire batches ended up in the trash. Most customers never saw these failures, but every failed batch taught the bakers something new. What they did not realize was that they were moving farther away from the original Austrian pastry, and one tiny mistake was quietly waiting to change baking history forever. The mistake did not happen with a loud crash. No oven exploded. No baker accidentally invented a recipe overnight. It unfolded so slowly that almost nobody noticed it. One baker rested the dough longer because a customer interrupted him. Another folded the butter one extra time after tearing the dough. Someone else worked on a colder winter morning and discovered the butter stayed firm much longer than usual. Another apprentice accidentally rolled the dough thinner than his master had intended. Each mistake seemed small, each looked unimportant. But together, they were changing the pastry forever. The secret was hidden inside something bakers now call laminated dough. Today, every pastry student learns the technique. But during the early 19th century, it demanded extraordinary skill. A large sheet of butter was wrapped inside dough. Then, the dough was rolled flat, folded, turned, and rolled again. Every fold multiplied the number of layers hidden inside. 3 folds became 9. 9 became 27. 27 became dozens, then hundreds of paper-thin layers separated only by butter. The process looked simple. It was anything but simple. The butter could not melt. The dough could not tear. The temperature had to remain almost perfect. Too warm, and the butter soaked into the dough, destroying every layer. Too cold, and the butter cracked into hard pieces that ripped through the dough like tiny stones. Every hour became a battle against nature itself. Without refrigeration, bakers relied only on experience. They judged butter with their fingertips. They judged dough by its feel beneath a rolling pin. They judged fermentation by smell alone. Every morning brought different weather. Every season demanded different decisions, and every mistake offered another lesson. Many bakers became frustrated. They threw ruined batches away without tasting them. Others did something different. They became curious. Instead of asking why a pastry had failed, they asked why it tasted better. That single question changed everything. Historians cannot point to one document describing the exact birth of the modern croissant because there almost certainly was no single birth. Instead, recipes evolved little by little. Anonymous bakers adjusted them across decades. Every generation inherited the work of the one before. No individual claimed ownership because no individual truly understood how significant the changes would become. The Austrian Kipferl slowly transformed into something completely new. The dough became lighter. The butter became richer. The layers became thinner. The crust became crisp enough to shatter beneath gentle pressure. Without realizing it, French bakers had stopped copying Austrian pastries. They had invented an entirely different masterpiece. Curiously, even the name reflected that gradual transformation. The French word croissant simply means crescent. Originally, the word described only the shape. A customer asking for a croissant was asking for something curved like a crescent moon, not necessarily the buttery layered pastry we know today. Different bakeries sold different versions. Some remained close to the old Austrian Kipferl, others became increasingly flaky through improved lamination. There was no official recipe. That would come much later. During the second half of the 19th century, France experienced enormous change. Railroads connected cities like never before. Flour traveled farther and faster. Butter reached markets in better condition. New milling techniques produced finer flour. Bakers could experiment with more consistent ingredients. Small improvements inside farms, mills, and transportation quietly improved pastries across the country. Customers noticed. They began requesting lighter pastries, crispier pastries, more buttery pastries. Competition pushed bakers even further. Every morning became a contest. Whose pastry had the finest layers? Whose crust cracked most beautifully? Whose butter produced the richest flavor? Without realizing it, thousands of customers were shaping history simply by choosing where to buy breakfast. Then, another unexpected figure entered the story. French pastry chefs began documenting techniques with greater precision. Cookbooks became more detailed. Professional apprenticeships spread improved methods throughout the country. Instead of relying only on family traditions, bakers learned standardized techniques. Knowledge that once stayed inside a single bakery could now travel across France. The croissant spread with it. By the early 20th century, the pastry had become deeply connected with French identity, even though many of its roots stretched back to Austria. Ironically, the world now believed the croissant had always been French. History had quietly rewritten itself. But that was not the last misunderstanding. As the 20th century progressed, industrialization transformed food production. Large factories could produce dough in enormous quantities. Mechanical mixers replaced hours of exhausting manual labor. Temperature-controlled storage solved many of the problems that had frustrated bakers for centuries. Then, frozen dough arrived. Suddenly, bakeries no longer needed to prepare every croissant from scratch. Hotels baked them. Restaurants baked them. Airlines served them. Supermarkets sold them. The croissant traveled farther in 50 years than it had during the previous 2 centuries. Yet many master bakers watched with growing concern. Something was disappearing. A machine could repeat a recipe. It could not replace judgment. Experienced bakers still adjusted their dough according to humidity, temperature, and the quality of each batch of flour. They knew that butter from one region behaved differently from butter produced elsewhere. They understood that rushing fermentation stole flavor from the final pastry. These were lessons learned through generations of mistakes. Machines followed instructions. Craftsmen followed experience. That debate continues even today. Walk into a small artisan bakery before sunrise. You will hear rolling pins sliding across wooden tables. You will smell butter warming gently inside the ovens. You will see bakers checking dough with quiet concentration. Many still fold each batch by hand because they believe tiny differences matter. And perhaps they do. Scientists now understand exactly why laminated pastries become flaky. Inside every layer of butter sits a small amount of water. As the pastry enters a hot oven, that water turns into steam. Steam expands rapidly. Because butter separates thin sheets of dough, the steam forces every layer apart. That creates the delicate honeycomb structure hidden inside a perfect croissant. The crisp sound you hear when breaking one open is not luck. It is physics. It is chemistry. It is engineering performed with flour and butter. But science explains only part of the story. Curiosity explains the rest. Every great improvement began with someone noticing something unexpected. Someone wondered why colder dough worked better. Someone noticed better butter created stronger layers. Someone discovered resting dough produced more flavor. None of those discoveries came from following instructions perfectly. They came from paying attention when something went wrong. That may be the greatest mistake in the entire history of the croissant. Not a baking mistake. A human mistake. People believed perfection created greatness. History suggests the opposite. Progress often begins with failure. The famous Vienna legend reflects this idea perfectly. Whether or not bakers truly uncovered Ottoman tunnels remains uncertain. Most historians agree the evidence is incomplete. Yet the story survives because it captures something people desperately want to believe: that ordinary workers can become heroes. That people who wake before dawn can change history. That courage sometimes looks like someone simply doing their job. Legends survive because they carry emotional truth, even when historical details remain debated. The croissant itself became another kind of legend. Today it belongs to everyone. Japanese bakers fill it with matcha cream and red bean paste. Italian bakeries create sweeter cousins called cornetti. Spanish cafes serve them with thick hot chocolate. American pastry chefs transformed them into giant breakfast sandwiches, almond-filled desserts, and even entirely new creations like the cronut, where croissant dough meets the shape of a donut. Each country added its own imagination. Each generation added another layer, just like the pastry itself. More than 2 billion croissants are now eaten around the world every year. Few people realize they are holding centuries of migration, trade, experimentation, and cultural exchange in their hands. Even fewer realize there was never one genius inventor waiting at the beginning. Instead, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands. Anonymous apprentices, patient masters, immigrant entrepreneurs like Auguste Zang, royal figures like Marie Antoinette, whose cultural influence may have opened French minds to Austrian baking, countless farmers producing better wheat, buttermakers improving their craft, millers refining flour. Every one of them added another piece. None of them could see the finished picture. Looking back, it is tempting to search for one magical moment, one accident, one forgotten batch, one baker who changed everything. History rarely works that way. The croissant was not born in a single morning. It grew slowly through centuries of mistakes that people refused to waste. That may be its greatest lesson. Failure only remains failure if nobody learns from it. Every crisp layer tells the story of someone who tried again. Every golden crust reminds us that curiosity is often more powerful than certainty. Every bite carries echoes of medieval Austria, royal France, immigrant ambition, scientific discovery, and the quiet determination of bakers who believed tomorrow's batch could always be better than today's. So the next time you sit beside a warm cup of coffee and gently pull apart a fresh croissant, listen carefully to that delicate crackle. It is more than the sound of buttery pastry. It is the sound of history unfolding one layer at a time. A history shaped not by perfection, but by countless tiny mistakes that became unexpected masterpieces. And perhaps that is why the croissant has endured for centuries, because hidden inside every flaky layer is a reminder that some of humanity's greatest creations were never part of the original plan. If you enjoyed uncovering the remarkable story behind one of the world's most famous pastries, don't forget to like the video. Subscribe for more documentaries about the accidental inventions that shaped our everyday lives, and watch the next story, where one ordinary mistake changed history in a way almost nobody saw coming.